Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the People of Web3 podcast. We're your hosts, Frank and Blaine. And today we have Rebecca joining us. Thank you for coming. And Rebecca and I met in person at the end of 2022, I think December, when I was hosting an event in Berlin. And she was the moderator and speaker, brought her whole NFT Club Berlin community to the events. So yeah, welcome, Rebecca. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Cool. I want to dive straight into NFT Club Berlin, actually. Can you tell us a little bit about, well, I guess before Web3, what you were doing, and then how did you get into Web3, and then what led you into building NFT Club Berlin?
All right. Well, I come from an art background. I studied fine art and I just continued to study and continue to study. And as an artist, it's quite a challenge to pay bills. So I worked as a tattoo artist for about 15 years. I'm in semi-retirement. But I ended up basically through all my studies with a PhD in anthropology, art, and Buddhism. And through my anthropological studies, it's very community focused. So understanding how communities function and how they communicate, how they use art to communicate, especially. And after I finished my PhD, I was like, I really need a break from academia. It's a really cutthroat kind of system, and it's not. I was a little bit burnt out, and I really wanted to get back to my art. So I got into live streaming. Actually, I got really hardcore onto Twitch. I ended up streaming for like 2,000 plus hours. My art, like I would stream my art process so people could see what I was painting. I'm a traditional artist, so it's a very kind of niche bubble in Twitch. And so I started that, I think 2019 or so, before the pandemic hit, and then everything shut down anyways. So, I could just focus on my art and streaming. And then in 2021, I was asked to be the lead artist on an NFT project. And I was like, I have no idea what that means. And I had heard some questionable things about NFTs.
Oh, yeah.
But it's my nature to research things and try to keep an open mind and focus on, okay, what does the data say? What is actually the truth about this? How do I divorce this from the sort of the noise that the media is talking about, and what's actually happening behind the scenes if I make an effort to learn a little more about it. And so I was on this team. I was the lead artist, and nobody else was doing any work. So I really dove in, and I had my research hat on, as I do. And I was like, okay, how are we going to make this project successful? What are the marketing strategies? What is the NFT ecosystem? What is this all about? And so I got really curious and really kind of I fell down the rabbit hole, as one does. And long story short, the project rugged me really hard.
No.
I did all the art, everything was like, I thought it could have been really successful. Actually, they had a pretty like solid idea. They had like some really good partnerships with the museums and different organizations. But long story short, they rugged. But I was already so deeply into the world of Web3 and understanding how revolutionary it is for artists in particular, that digital asset ownership was for me absolutely mind-blowing. And the fact that there was royalties involved that made an artist's career more sustainable. You have direct ownership of your artwork. You have direct communication and relationships with your collectors, rather than just giving your artwork away to a gallery. And kind of also removing all the high barrier of entry into the gallery world as well. Because unless you're somebody from a certain socioeconomic status and you have the right connections, you don't get into the gallery world. So for me, it was a real eye-opener of a new system that was giving so much new opportunity and potential to artists that I'm like, okay, this is my home now. And so yeah, And then into 2021, to finish the question, 2021, I co-founded the NFT Club Berlin, and then we started doing more collaborations with Solana as well. And then the beginning of this year, I officially started working for Solana and co-founded the Solana Super Team Germany. And now we are here.
And now we are here.
Yes.
You mentioned the rabbit hole. You kind of fell into that rabbit hole. You kind of probably touched on what kind of started that process, but what was the thing that kind of led you down that rabbit hole? Was it the ownership, the kind of the unique artist opportunities that could exist in Web3 and not in Web2? Like what was that kind of thing that kind of you fell through that rabbit hole after kind of discovering Web3?
I think it was maybe the whole package of it.
The whole package.
The fact that it wasn't just one thing. So there wasn't just one thing to hold on to. It wasn't just royalties, and it wasn't just ownership, and it wasn't just the fact that the galleries weren't taking 50%. Also, a really big part of it too was the community aspect. I've always been very kind of isolated with my art, and always, just kind of in my own little bubble. And getting into the NFT world was the first time that I really kind of got involved a lot deeper with artist communities, which is very supportive and very uplifting. So that was also part of the stickiness of it. And yeah, kind of like I mentioned, I'm a very avid learner, and it showed me this entirely new field of knowledge that I didn't know anything about, and a new opportunity to really grow and challenge myself. And so yeah, I think that's the main point.
So much I want to dive into, way more than I thought. I didn't even know you started working for Solana officially. I saw it on your Twitter recently, like before our call. I saw what was it called? Super
Team. Yes.
Super Team.
I wanted to ask you about it, but I didn't know it's official Solana. So you're official Solana staff now.
Yes, exactly. Since the beginning of the year. And Super Team is basically like the global outreach branch of Solana Foundation. So there's different super teams around the world. There's India, Vietnam, Turkey, Mexico, UK just launched as well. And so we're really just here to help build and support the ecosystem. So we're able to give out grants. We do sort of like co-working spaces. We do events. Our mission is just to really bring people together and give them the opportunities that they might not have otherwise, and give them support and funding or guidance. We're doing like creator onboarding events as well to teach artists how to use a wallet, what is security, and what not to do with your seed phrase, how to mint stuff. And so that's sort of the role that the Super Team has. And then within that, I am focused specifically on building up the creator ecosystem.
Interesting.
And
you mentioned
you go, brother.
I was kind of
I feel so many questions brewing.
I know. I think you go.
No, you go.
All right, I'll go. Well, you mentioned that as an artist, you were delighted to find out about the whole artist community within the Web3 space, that how we can utilize NFTs to connect with collectors and fellow artists. And that aspect really didn't happen in like Web2, right? Because a lot of the artists that I talk to, they usually just kind of stay in their studio, stay in their home and create their art, but they don't really reach out to other artists, let alone like artists from other disciplines outside of theirs. And even like collectors, they want collectors to purchase their art, but they don't really have any connections with anyone who are potential collectors. They don't really do anything with communities. I mean, most of them that I talk to, like, they don't even do much on social media to build the personal brand online. So when you step into the NFT space, did you feel like there were a lot of artists who were willing to put in the effort to build the community? Did did they put the effort because they got into NFT, or were these people who were always active, but NFT just kind of provided a platform for all of these individuals to gather?
I think it's a real mixture. And things are also very different than they were, a year and a half ago, for example. So the motivations also can change, and the reasons for people getting interested can also change. And speaking about, like I say, about a year and a half ago, year ago, I think it was a real mix of those two factors, of people that were like, oh, wow, I can actually create art and potentially have financial gain, because, you heard about all these stories of all these people that were just swimming in money and like finally making their art dreams come true, which also brought in a lot of people that didn't have any kind of art background. They were just kind of interested in the financial aspect of it. And as time went on, as the crypto winter got colder, as the bear market got more bearish, there has been a huge shift in the amount of people that have been engaged with all of our communities, or even when we do calls for artists, and the number of people that just don't have active Twitter accounts anymore, for example. And that does play a really big role, because a lot of people, it's a real challenge to have that resolve to really stick with it. And there are some people that get really deeply involved with the communities, and that really, really helps. I think most people that I know that are still really active, they have really meaningful connections with a lot of the other artists and collectors and communities, which makes it a lot easier to kind of withstand this long, kind of hard period. But it also shows that the people that are getting involved now are doing it for slightly different reasons, right? I don't think there's that many people that are getting involved with NFTs right now because they see a quick buck to be made, right? They're a little bit more into it for the theoretical side of, okay, it's decentralized and there's digital asset ownership is really incredible, and they believe more in the ethos of it, or out of curiosity, or they see sort of this longer term future. But yes, to answer the question, I think it has really changed, and I think that's some of the interest of the different kinds of creators that are now entering the ecosystem versus a year and a half ago.
Okay, that's interesting. Oh, just real quick on that one, you kind of find that in these different cycles, you have the bull market, the bear market, in these different cycles, it attracts different sorts of people. It happens with the builders, investors, and also the creators. It's kind of quite interesting that applies everywhere. I had one question on, because you obviously interact with a lot of different artists, both in the bull market and now in the bear market. What are some of the things that artists don't like about Web3? Like, I'm obviously biased. I come from a creative background. I kind of see a lot of positives, but what are some of the things that turn off a lot of creatives when you bring up the word NFT or Web3?
I think it's really the preconceived notions of what it is. The more people learn about it, the more interested and curious they often get. The biggest hurdle is this preconceived notion that it's environmentally unfriendly, that crypto is just made out of like crypto bros, just like 20-year-old degen guys flipping JPEGs. It's just misinformation, especially about the art ecosystem. When people hear NFTs, they think of apes and PFP projects, and it's getting over this first hurdle of education and misinformation, because to understand, okay, what does this actually mean? How does this work? It is complex. And there is a certain amount of patience and open-mindedness that you need to have in order to overcome those preconceived notions. And also on top of it, understand the technical side of it, which does not come naturally to a lot of artists, myself included. It was a real struggle. So that's also why I do these kinds of onboarding workshops for artists, because I know how hard it was for me without any real support, and there was nobody I could really ask for help. So being able to provide that is something that I wish I would have had. So trying to make it a little bit easier as a barrier to entry. But besides that, I think the general bubbles of that it can be a little bit crypto bro-y, and that there is the side of the NFT flippers can turn people off, but once they understand that there's a different side of it, usually it changes their perspectives, from my experience anyways.
One last question from me is, how many people are there in the NFT Club Berlin again?
We don't have like a set way to measure membership. It's an open community, so anybody can join, anybody can come to our events. Through all of our social media, we have, I don't know, 10-15K people probably. I think even just on Meetup it's 3 something K. So we have a pretty wide network, and it's a real mixture of professionals or degens and artists and people that are just really curious. They're just looking for, some information, and other people that are really hardcore full-time Web3. And of course it fluctuates with the market, or how busy people are, or how many resources I myself have to put on events. So yeah, it's very vague, but it also is fluctuated. It is a little bit hard to track.
Cool.
You kind of touched.
I was gonna say, I love the community, a lot of artists in the NFT Club Berlin, because last time when we did the events in Berlin, it was like all artists. We have like traditional artists who's only heard about NFTs for the first time. We have some who are kind of curious and still learning, and then we have some who have minted artwork, sold some artwork, and it was a nice mix. I really like the atmosphere from your community.
Absolutely. And that event that we did together was very art focused. We did like an art panel, so everybody on the panel was artists or somehow really deeply engaged with NFT art. And so each of the events also draw out a certain kind of demographic from the club as well. So that one was definitely very art focused. And we do, because my background is in art, typically a lot of the events are more art focused, or doing exhibitions and things like that. So, but it really depends. If it's a very general mixer or more of a general education or panel or something like that, then the demographic is a little bit different.
Cool.
On the NFT Club Berlin and I guess starting that community, I think you touched on it earlier on, but what was the reason for starting it kind of in the first place? And for listeners who are maybe new to Web3 or have been in Web3 for a while and are thinking of maybe starting a community, in what situation would it make sense to maybe start their own community versus, maybe just finding one that already exists? Like, what was that reason for you starting one, and maybe give some tips for someone who's thinking of starting their own or joining one? That's probably a lot of different questions in one, but I hope you know what I mean.
It's all good. Very basically, nothing existed in Berlin that had anything to do with NFTs. And so there was just a recognition that there wasn't any meetup or any group where people could get together and have this joined interest together. So that was basically it.
So there wasn't anyone to join anyway. So
no, exactly.
You kind of were forced to start one yourself.
Exactly. And it started as just a very simple meetup page, just like meeting up at a bar, meeting up at just like a location. And it started with like 10-20 people. And within a few months, we were doing events with hundreds of people. And it's the scene in Berlin also grew exponentially at that time. And we could see that there was a lot of sort of fractionalization, that there's, you know, a lot of people really enjoy creating their own projects and just kind of doing their own thing, which I think is also valuable. And, you know, everybody should create what they want to create. And I also recognize that we as a community can be stronger when we work together. And it's much more my ethos to be more collaborative than competitive. So NFT Club Berlin was a very like open umbrella. Like I've always been really happy to collaborate with most anybody that is on kind of the same wavelength as us and has the same ideals and isn't just interested in shilling a project or product or trying to sell something in a kind of questionable way. We're a nonprofit and we've never sold anything, and it's important for me to keep the community very neutral in that sense. We don't want to exploit them in any kind of way. We don't want to, like, I don't feel like I don't enjoy the feeling of being sold things. So I wouldn't want to do that to my community as well. But I did notice that there was this kind of fractionalization, and I think it has potentially negatively impacted Berlin as a larger ecosystem. And for people that are interested in starting their own community or starting a community, I think it is really valuable to first look at the ecosystem where you are located, and kind of assess, okay, what is already going on? What can I maybe contribute to? Because being a organizer or leader of a nonprofit community can be a real challenge, and there are often not enough people or helping hands. And so kind of helping bolster and move projects forward that are potentially already established, I think is also something that doesn't get enough attention or thought. And so I think it's important to look at the larger ecosystem of where you are and what kind of longer term impact you'd like to have. Because when we look at Berlin, we think Berlin, and similar to Lisbon as well, has potential and already is actually one of the main centers of Web3 in Europe. And yet in some senses, we feel like we're losing that grip a little bit because it has become so divided, and people are just kind of doing their own thing. They're like, no, I want this to be my project. And people are like, oh no, but I want to do this thing. And I think returning to the spirit of Web3 as a very cooperative and very collaborative kind of open exchange is really important. But it also means people have to overcome some of their own ego and their own shortcomings potentially, and make the effort to work together rather than just, you know, doing, often what we typically do is just doing something for ourselves and for our own profits. So that's my answer for that one.
Interesting.
I always wonder if it's possible to gather these organizers in the location and just have a discussion about what do we each want to do, and kind of have an agreement, like from organizer to organizer, rather than being so separated and then kind of guessing and assuming what other people are thinking, what they're doing. I wonder if anyone has tried that and if it works.
Exactly. That's part of the challenge too. And I mean, people have their different organizations for different reasons too, right? Some are based entirely around a specific business model or NFT project. And so it's important for them to create revenue and focus on the business aspect of it, which doesn't always necessarily mesh with a project that is trying to be open for everybody and isn't, you know, trying to push one thing in particular. So I think it's normal that there's going to be a wide array of differences. But I think if there is the potential to find somebody that is doing something similar to what you want to achieve, I recently had this as well, that there was a longtime community member from NFT Club, and he was recently thinking about making his own NFT art community. And then he's like, well, actually, wait a second, like this already exists. Like, why don't I just get in touch and see if we can do something together? And now he's starting to head a bunch of different initiatives for NFT Club. And so it's kind of like a win-win that he doesn't need to start from scratch. And I also get the, somebody that's bringing new life and new interest and support. So I think that kind of relationship is really valuable and sometimes also a little underrated for people,
I agree. Yeah, it's very difficult to start from scratch. Especially if there are already other communities happening, and during this time of the market, very difficult. And I think organizing events, that's also kind of underappreciated. Being an event organizer, there's so much work behind the scenes. I've only learned it after hosting some events. It's a lot.
I know, and you were doing things so last minute sometimes too. They're like, okay, now I'm in Berlin. I was like, oh wow, okay, but hey, you pulled it off. You made it happen.
I mean, because of you, because we
your
collaborated.
schedule last year was crazy. Like Greg was in Bali, and then we're like, oh, what are you up to next week? He's like, oh, I'm going to like France and then England and then Germany. I'm like,
I
what the hell?
know.
I don't recommend it, but yeah,
Hey, you made it happen.
You got it
yeah, it
done.
forced me to make it happen. And some events, bigger turnout than others, but generally speaking, everyone who came really enjoyed it. Because also I'm not like shilling any project, I wasn't selling anything. But yeah, so now all these connections that I made, I can kind of have deeper conversations with you guys through this podcast. And over time, people are also doing more interesting things. And I don't know, just it's really cool. It's really worth it, but it was so exhausting.
Absolutely. Even just the learning experience, right? Even just going through that process and growing so much in such a short amount of time, because you are kind of in a pressure cooker. Like, it is challenging, but all of those experiences propelled you to where you are now. And so much of it is really about the connections that you have and the people that you know and the opportunities that grow from that, right? So it's, you get to now enjoy the after effects of all that hard work.
Yeah.
That laugh wasn't very convincing, Frank. It was like,
I'm just reliving like last year, like for those listening, just for context, like last year within 2 months, I did events with my like art community brand in 6 different countries within 2 months. Like a lot of them is back to back. I literally land, in that city for 1 week, and within that week I have to pull everything together, get venue, get collaborations, get the community speakers, posters, marketing, and then doing one event. And I couldn't enjoy any like touristy things while I'm there because I'm just in my hotel the whole time.
Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, it was so intense, but I'm really grateful I made that decision to push myself to do it. Got to meet a lot of cool people. For example, Rebecca. Yeah, so okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next question. Since you're an artist and I'm also an artist and Blaine is also very much in the art space, I'm always curious to listen to other artists, how they kind of stepped into, making the decision of, okay, I'm gonna do art as part of my career. And how's that going previous to Web3? And then now that you're in Web3 for a couple of years, seeing all these new potentials, has it made it an impact for you to kind of, at least for me, like now more than ever, it seems like being a full-time artist is more practical and more sustainable potentially. Of course, there's still a lot of work to put in, a lot of things to improve, but compared to like before, a couple of years ago, it's way, way, way more practical. So I want to see your feelings, your thoughts, and what do you think the future is going to hold for those who are looking to become a full-time artist?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had the goal of being an artist ever since I could hold a pencil. I was sent to painting classes instead of soccer or whatever, because that's all I wanted to do. It's never been an choice or an option for me. It's just sort of somehow embedded in this human experience that I'm currently in. And trying to find, like I kind of mentioned, like I tried a whole bunch of different avenues to kind of make it sustainable through tattooing and streaming or commissions, designs, selling my prints, like all this kind of stuff. Because getting into galleries was, the gatekeeping was always so extreme, and I never felt like I fit into that world, and I don't come from the right social class as well to like be able to fake to fake that I could belong there. And so for me, it's, yeah, Web3 really opened up a lot of potential, I think is the main word, that I saw that there was this new avenue that where I could potentially support myself. And in the last few years, I have been part of more exhibitions than I have in my entire life. And what's really interesting as well is that I feel like NFTs have given me like a little bit of like a backdoor entry into the gallery world as well, because a lot of galleries, actually not a lot of galleries, there's very few, but some galleries have this little bit of like, oh, NFTs or something, maybe we should get on the bandwagon, maybe we should try something out. And some galleries are experimenting a little bit, or are just kind of curious and are interested in doing exhibitions around that theme. But because there's so few NFT artists, you're not held up to the same kind of rigor. You know, they don't look at your CV and like, oh, you haven't done 10 solo shows in the last year, so you can't come, right? So you're given a different kind of standard, which allows a lot more access and a lot more kind of like preferential treatment if you haven't gone through that really traditional path of grinding out at galleries and getting to know all the bigwig curators and everything like that. And so even just my exhibitions that have happened in the last 2 years in IRL galleries, it's happened all because of NFTs. It's kind of given me a new way to show my art, but also uplift other artists in our ecosystem and bring some kind of new art into the galleries as well. Because previously there was no way to exhibit animation or 3D art or digital painting or any of these digital native artworks. And so now that it's starting to slowly, very, very slowly be a little bit of a topic that some galleries are kind of curious about, it really opens up a lot of opportunities for those of us that don't come from that kind of background. So I think that is one of the opportunities that's been really interesting, and kind of joining the traditional and NFT worlds for me is really interesting, because the traditional art world hasn't changed in hundreds of years. And this is the most revolutionary and challenging thing that can happen to this sort of establishment, you know? So I think that has been a really big feature that I wasn't expecting at all for my own art, or to see kind of as a trend as well. In terms of just the community involvement and feeling like I have potential to make a really positive impact in our art community, for me was really exciting and inspiring. And so I do balance my time between my art and working for Solana Super Team, and also NFT Club, which is a little bit quiet at the moment because I'm not doing so many events for NFT Club. But you know, finding this balance and recognizing that it's, especially in the market conditions, going into full-time artist isn't necessarily always the wisest choice, and taking it a little bit as a longer term approach, because our ecosystem is so young. and to really kind of understand, okay, we're building this kind of foundation for the future, and not to run into just like leap into something that maybe isn't quite sustainable quite yet. But because of the systems that are put in place, like royalties, for example, I can imagine that NFTs will be much more sustainable for artists that want to make a full-time living at it, compared to always having to chase that one art sale. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. Like, it's not fully ready for people to become full-time artists just because we step into Web3 and NFTs. But you brought up a great point about leveraging the NFT opportunity as kind of a backdoor to mainstream traditional galleries, because some of them, they are curious and they start to collaborate with NFT artists just because, you know, they can use that NFT buzzword, even though some might not have any clue about it. But it does bring in new opportunities for artists who couldn't traditionally get into galleries. And then there are some galleries who are new, they focus just on digital art. So they have only digital screens, and they are always looking for digital artists, NFT artists specifically. And I think there's just a lot more opportunities for those of us who couldn't get in before to leverage this opportunity. It's not going to be here forever. So take advantage while the competition is still not too high. But I feel like if you bring yourself in now, eventually you can, when the more galleries kind of put Web3 NFT artists and traditional artists together, you kind of get into the galleries with the traditional art, kind of blending them as well later on.
Yeah.
So exciting.
It was interesting when you said CV from the perspective of an artist, because that's not probably something you'd normally associate with, I guess, artists or art, but the idea around the gatekeeping. So they often require this kind of CV of, okay,
Absolutely.
show me your evidence of XYZ. If you don't fit that criteria, then you can't enter into this exclusive club. That gatekeeping aspect is obviously something that most people in Web3 don't like, for good reason, because it kind of restricts a lot of access to certain things or certain opportunities. Yes, I just wanted to kind of touch on that thing because it was kind of interesting, like CV and artists. It was, and then the gatekeeping part. Yeah, the Web3 opens that up to just so many different, not just artists, but anyone who is wanting to communicate or express themselves or build something. There's not this middle person like there was in the Web2 world. It kind of opens it up to kind of everyone, which is pretty exciting.
Absolutely. And especially because it's so tightly controlled and not in the artist's favor. You know, even the fact that galleries usually take 50% is a very average cut for an art sale. And it's a really hard business to be in the gallery business. Like, their overheads are really high. Like, a lot of galleries don't make that much money anyways. Like, they also really struggle with their own business models.
It's quite cutthroat.
But it is, absolutely. And that's also why having this sort of like really professional CV of like, I've had solo shows at this renowned gallery and this gallery, and I was in group shows in this amazing gallery, right? Like, they look very specifically, especially if they want to include an artist and have a solo show or have them as a resident artist or anything like that. They have to be very, very picky of like, okay, who is going to collect this artwork? What kind of sale history do they have? What is the average price of their work? Where did they study? Like, did they go just to like a random college to learn art? Did they study at all? Whereas, okay, they studied at one of the top fine art schools. And because these are all things that collectors in the traditional art world really care about.
Interesting.
Compared to collectors in the NFT world is an entirely different situation, right? Most collectors in the NFT world have typically come over from like finance and PFP projects and have slowly kind of gotten more interested in one-of-one art, especially with the market shifts and being tired of all like the 10K PFP project rugs and all the drama that goes with it and chasing whitelist and whatever. And then finding these kinds of communities where it is a lot more uplifting and wholesome, and you can have really uplifting relationships with the different artists, and you get to invest in a person in their career. And there is a financial incentive sometimes behind it as well. Same in traditional art collecting, where you think that this artist actually has really potential to grow their career and to make it. And so it's a little bit of a longer term investment strategy versus like PFP flipping that happens within like minutes or hours. But it just means that the collector base within the NFT world is very different than in the traditional arts world. And there's different kind of priorities or different interests. And the collector base in the NFT world is also quite new to it as well. Like it's not firstly, the ecosystem is really, really young, right? And also a lot of the people in the ecosystem are quite young, and they might not have had that much contact with art in the past. They are only just now developing their own taste and understanding what it means to them, compared to people that collect fine art in the traditional world. They're usually 60, 70 plus. You need to have an astronomical amount of money. And they're typically of the certain social strata where they're very cultured and very particular about their tastes and what that means to their friends, etc. Right? So we're dealing with very, very different worlds. And I think the collector aspect is particularly interesting, especially in the NFT scene, because it's such an unusual aspect that hasn't been really developed before. And it's something that people don't talk about that much. So I find it especially
I was gonna say, it's not being talked about much. So when you're sharing it, it's very intriguing. Yeah, that definitely allowed a lot more people to start their art collection journey. And yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. And I've started to do this series of roundtables to really kind of dive into some of these topics. So the last roundtable was actually on collecting. So I got about 20 of the top collectors in the Solana ecosystem all together, and they all shared, well, not everybody shared, but we did short presentations, and they shared sort of how they feel about the general ecosystem and what can be done to improve it. And so having those kinds of open discussions, I think, is really beneficial as a larger kind of, and they're topics that people don't typically talk about so much, but I find are fascinating. So I'm really grateful that I have the opportunity to kind of do that sort of stuff.
Wait, where's that? You hosted that?
Exactly. So it's a series. Sorry?
Was it a Spaces? Was it a private call? What kind of format?
I've been doing them on Zoom, actually, so that you can see people's faces, and you can do presentations as well. I love Twitter Spaces, but it's a little bit limited, and it's a little informal. So we're taking a little bit more of a research approach, and people can do actual presentations as well. Some people do. And it's a series of roundtables, and each roundtable has a different topic. So the first one I did was all about the creator communities. So we had the leads or founders of a whole bunch of the different main Solana art communities, and they gave presentations about what their biggest challenges were and what they think the general arts community ecosystem needs as well. And then one on collectors. The next one is going to be on tooling. So different kinds of tools that creators need and can benefit from, and what's lacking. And so it's kind of, the idea is to sort of take a step back and be a little bit more objective about the general space. And it's like, okay, well, what is actually really going to benefit us, and what are our main challenges? Because if we don't recognize those challenges, we can't necessarily overcome them. So kind of taking that sort of approach, I think, is really exciting.
Is that something accessible to the public? Do you have recordings? Can people join you on the Zoom?
Absolutely. We do announce them through Super Team, and I send out lots of invites for people that are interested, and because it is Solana ecosystem focused, I assume that not everybody would be interested. But they are public. The next one the date hasn't been set quite yet. But yeah, everybody's welcome to join the Zoom and to sit in. I usually book the who's going to present previously, so there's not always spots to present, and I usually am quite particular for each roundtable of like who is actually really an expert and really relevant for this topic. And so, but yeah, for listening, everybody is welcome.
That's fair. Cool. I want to join one of those.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, you're welcome to.
That's another part I love about Web3 is like these sorts of things. Like, let's all come together, let's brainstorm about a particular thing. Like that probably wouldn't happen as much, outside of Web3. On your art, what medium do you primarily work in? And since entering Web3, has your art changed at all? Like your creativity, your style, the mediums that you work in, has that changed at all? Has that sparked anything?
Interesting question. I'm typically a traditional artist. I work in mostly with my papers, many folders of papers. I do mostly paper-based, a little bit of canvas. There's a lot of skulls in my life, but I go through different phases of realistic versus much more abstract. And I feel like I had gone through a long phase of, studying fine art, and it was really important that things look very figurative, and it's more kind of focused on realism. And in the last year or so, I've been able to kind of really let myself be more experimental and kind of appreciate another side of my art that I kind of repressed because I didn't appreciate it as art in and of itself, because it wasn't looking like something in particular and showing off, the composition and the shading and the 3D, whatever. And it's also allowed me to get really creative with how I distribute it. And especially, so one of my themes that I've been playing with in the last year and a half is sort of like this fractionalization. So basically, I don't know if I have many examples. Usually I'm just like surrounded by art stuff.
Typical artist.
Exactly. But one example that's kind of interesting, at Breakpoint, I did ink paintings, and then I cut up the ink paintings. So I before cutting it up, I scanned them. And so I minted the high-res scans of the art pieces, and then I cut up the pieces of paper and I gave out the individual little segments of the artwork. So everybody I met and kind of had a connection to, like, they would get a piece of that artwork, basically. And then more recently, I've started that, but in a larger scale. So I have this the series that I'm doing right now is knocking on my door, but I'm going to ignore them. I had a 3-meter long canvas, and I did this big painting on it. And for the opening exhibition, I cut it up into 21 segments, and then I high-res scanned all of the segments, and sort of it's the same or similar sort of process of this destroying my own artwork and then connecting the different collectors that collect each piece. One of the pieces I just did as an open free edition. Actually, if you guys are interested, it's still available. And so NFTs have kind of allowed me to play around with that kind of thing a little bit more, like distribution and editions and destroying my artwork, but still having it exist, but not really. So playing with these kinds of themes of impermanence, are very near and dear to my heart, because my art is mostly very based in my Buddhist background, I guess you could say.
Interesting. That creativity, how that's kind of sparked maybe something since like the last year or so is quite interesting. And the thing about exploring, you mentioned distribution. I think one thing with Web3, well, blockchain, and the fact that it's kind of this immutable thing, it's you know, the ownership aspect, that creativity can be incorporated not just into a thing, but could be incorporated over a longer period of time. Like how you don't just create it, how do you distribute it, what happens once someone has it? Like it kind of opens up the possibilities of where you can be creative as well, which is quite interesting. Because like if someone purchases a piece of art, you know, a painting or whatever, you have little control around what happens after that point. Whereas on the blockchain, it's kind of there is some influence that you can have beyond the fact of someone purchasing it, if that makes sense. I'm a little bit tired, but that's quite interesting. We are nearing the end of the podcast, but for those that want to connect with you, where can they find you online? What pages, Twitter, you know?
Yeah, I am obviously active on Twitter mostly. Dr. Revel is typically where you can find me. I think Twitter is Dr_Revel, REVEL_NFT. Yeah, or Rebecca Revel anywhere online. Typically I'm not that hard to find. So also all of our things through Super Team DE on Twitter, and NFT Club Berlin on Twitter too, for our different events or roundtables or anything like that.
Cool. I'm just following you now. You've got one of your cool skulls as your profile picture, I see.
Yes, I do. That's actually I just saw that one too.
Right, you.
The root of suffering is attachment. Ooh.
Yes.
Deep.
Yes, my life is very guided by Buddhist principles, and that is a big part of my own spiritual path, but also my artistic path, and they're very interlinked. So you'll see you'll see a lot of that.
I feel like that would be an interesting podcast topic as well, to be honest. I'd be interested to see how that translates into a digital world, those sorts of values and philosophies. So maybe a future podcast for those that are interested in Buddhism. For the closing question, it's kind of a fun one. What you kind of talked about earlier, we're at the very early days, we're kind of laying the foundations, not just for Web3 art, but just like in general. What excites you the most about the future of Web3 kind of art in particular?
Just the expansion of opportunities for artists throughout the whole world, and for all of the artists that previously didn't have the opportunity to sell their work, you know, like 3D artists or generative artists, or even animators, anybody that's digitally native. They previously didn't have the option to make a living off of their art unless they were doing some kind of side hustle or as a designer or something like that. So I think for me, the most exciting things are the opportunities it creates, in terms of a little bit more financial stability for artists, but also the opportunities it creates in terms of creativity. That the blockchain as a tool has opened up so many different avenues of creativity, and is being in some senses used as its own kind of artistic medium, right? The way that people can change their metadata or add something or have collectors involved. There's so much that has never been done before, and I think it's absolutely just so exciting to see how people are using it in really forward-thinking and interesting ways, and are sort of bringing the entire art ecosystem forward by allowing these new kinds of mediums and really thinking outside the box, because we have this new technology and it's really, our imagination is the limit. Well, and the amount of depths we have, but but typically, you know, like it allows for such an entirely new area of creativity, which I think is also really exciting.